Hello, and welcome to Therapy for Nerds. This is your host, Cassidy Russell, along with.
Abbey Ronquillo, and this is
Busse.
And today we wanted to talk about our thoughts on the documentary that's on Netflix called The Social Dilemma. And Katie, I know you were kind of the original person that brought it up and wanted to talk about it. So, how about you start us off?
For me, I think this was something I wanted to bring up because in my work, it's something I've been asked a lot about. I've encountered a lot of different people who've watched this, parents, young adults, people wanting to learn about technology and kind of the impact on their own lives or the lives of their children. And one thing that I feel like I was consistently encountering was people who were almost afraid of devices after watching it. Like there was a lot of fear around like what's going on, what do I not know about? And so it actually was the only reason I really went out and watched it, because I'd heard about it, but I was like, I don't know, I'm not good at sitting down and watching things sometimes. So I watched it and I thought it was a very interesting documentary. And I think there's a lot of really important points that we can talk about today because it touches on, and for those of you who haven't seen it, you can go out and watch it. We're going to have some spoilers potentially ahead, just as a disclaimer here, but it talks a lot about the impact of technology, advertising, the impact of social media on, young adults, teens, adults. And I think there was a lot of really important messages being made, but a lot of fear that was being generated in the process.
I think that was my main issue with it was the amount of fear that it was. I also, disclaimer, did not watch this when I was in a very good mood, so I feel like that might have tainted my thoughts on it. But I definitely felt there was a lot of fear mongering within the documentary, which, I mean, documentaries are typically made to for some sort of point, and oftentimes because fear is a very easy emotion to exploit in film, that's tends to be what documentaries, like, that tends to be what the point is, to instill some sort of fear about something or other. So I understood it on that level, but I also just personally found it a little irritating. um Abby, what are your thoughts?
it's so funny. When I first watched this, everyone was talking, like Katie said, a lot of my clients were talking about it and they were just like, wow, that was so life changing. I had no idea this was going on and, talking about it like it was a big deal. So I was like, you know what, I have to see it. And while I was watching it, my initial reaction was like, I don't know if it's just because of me being a part of that generation of growing on the internet and kind of being aware of the development of social media, being more, I don't know, woke to the idea that, hey, this is kind of could be a bad thing if you use too much of it, and kind of having the sense of this advertisement placement and all of that. I didn't feel like the news was new news, but I definitely feel like you're right, Cassie, in the sense that there was a lot of fear-based tactics that were utilized within the narrative. And I could put myself in the shoes or the position of a parent watching this and identifying like, wow, maybe I don't use Facebook that much, or I don't use these apps that much, but my kids do. And I don't know what they do on their phones. Is this what they're looking at? Is this what they feel when they're looking at that screen all day?
There's two pieces to this really, because there is the piece of like there should be accountability within corporations, and if they hold a lot of private information for people and a lot of the data that's being released on the internet, like, and I think that's the message I took away from it a lot, is like the call to action on holding companies responsible for the information and the products that they're creating. And I think that's a very valid point. I think like the piece was with people of maybe not understanding what it was supposed to be communicating in some pieces, because I think there was a piece of it communicating that, and then also lock up your phones, they're really bad for you, but not giving us much direction on how we can necessarily protect ourselves. It was like phones are scary and bad, and advertising is stealing all your data, and you're going to turn into this amorphous individual who's just being fed advertising at a constant rate. But I didn't walk away knowing what to do about it. And I think that's what created so much fear for a lot of people, is there's a problem, we see it's a problem, but we don't know what to do. And I think a lot of reactions was, okay, well, I'm pulling away then entirely.
Yeah, I definitely agree that they presented a problem, And then when kind of asked for a solution, the only thing that it really seemed to say was like, hold businesses accountable, which like, yeah, we definitely should. The ability for us to hold businesses accountable is currently not that high. Like, and maybe this is me being pessimistic about our current landscape, but it's so having something that we can do in the meantime while we try to wrangle in these kinds of companies would have been great. I thought having a therapist or people that specialize in mental health would have been really helpful, but they had like what, one psychologist throughout the whole film. It's like an hour and 40 minutes. Like they couldn't have another psychologist come on and talk about actual studies that were done about it, because that was another thing that I took issue with. Was they had all of these former tech people come in and talk about what they thought was happening, but they didn't really have any concrete studies or things done by the mental health field.
Yeah. And one thing that I noticed at some point during the documentary, they brought up a lot of statistics regarding suicide rates in the last decade, and they drew a correlation between social media and suicide rates in teens. I believe it was teens or young adults, that younger generations. And then it was just like, that was just kind of dropped, that they thought that there was a correlation, and it wasn't really explored. And for me, I found that very startling, because I don't think suicide is a topic that we can just lightly bring up and then kind of move on from. And I can see why that would also lead to a lot of parents being afraid, because correlation is not causation. Like, we are seeing increasing suicide rates, and I think it's a very multifaceted issue within our culture right now. And I think it was very abruptly brought up and then kind of like moved past. And I would be scared if I was a parent, if I saw a documentary and they said, look at social media and look at suicide rates. I'd be like, my kid's going to kill themselves if they're on Instagram too much. And I can see why that'd be so startling for people.
Yeah, and I definitely think that, obviously looking at this documentary, it was created by the former head, right, of Data for Democracy, that one, I forgot the name of the speaker, but the person who kind of spearheaded the project brought in a lot of his friends and former colleagues, the people that were in the trenches, people who come from the tech industry. So I feel like the perspective is those people who were creating this data, creating this social media, creating these platforms that cause the issue, not so much from the perspective of mental health or what to do. Well, that call to action was there, but they weren't looking at it as how detrimental it was scientifically, I guess. It was more of like their first person experience of like, hey, we made this and ooh, this is a problem, because we felt it ourselves. Like, I remember one of them had explicitly said that they would come home and they even realized that they were like addicted to the email, even though they knew that they were making it in certain types of algorithms and they knew what was happening. They couldn't stop themselves. I do feel like it would have made the arguments a lot stronger had they backed it up with data. Like, for me personally, I like having that type of data. But I think the reason that they didn't include the data was because they were more so just trying to document, I guess, like in real time what it felt like, or like what the experience was, or their point of view, if that makes sense.
Well, they were using themselves as a case study, which like case studies can be very interesting. But normally case studies, I feel, should be like either a jumping off point or like there's already been research and here's this case study that kind of is a good example of it and humanizes that research a little bit. Going back to what Katie was saying about the suicide rates, honestly, before I watched the documentary, I read an article by Christopher Ferguson, who was one of the authors of the book Moral Combat, which I read earlier and talked about in an earlier episode. And that was something that he brought up in his article, how the social dilemma got social media mostly wrong. Was, yes, suicide rates for teenage girls have gone up in the last 10 years, but that was cherry-picked data in that suicide rates for every age group has gone up for the last 10 years.
Yeah.
And yeah, we can focus on teenage girls, which but we should be talking about the overall rates and why are the overall rates going up. Mental health is in a crisis in this country, and what's being done about it.
Yeah, and I think that that piece is really important, like what you're bringing up now is the way we present information conveys a message. And if we present a limited piece of information saying, look at the suicide rates in girls and look at the increase in social media, and that's taken out of context in the fact that overall suicide rates for all groups are increasing. For groups who don't use social media, there's a message that's not being totally brought to the table there, and it can be misinterpreted because of that. And I think the individuals who were in this documentary had a unique perspective here because they were people who were high players in the tech industry. Like they'd been CEOs, they'd been managers, they'd been all of these different really high roles. A lot of them were like on the ground floor of when these companies were being built. So they obviously have such a unique perspective that we don't know about. And I think that's really important. And I think it's great for us to be able to hear about that. I think there is the piece of like, we just have to be careful the way we present information so that people are able to get a holistic understanding of what's going on. And if we have areas that maybe we are not as, I guess, qualified in talking about, we're careful in how we present that information rather than dropping some suicide rates and not explaining a little bit more about that.
Right. Yeah, and I think you're right. And it's kind of, I guess, a little bit ironic that this documentary did that, and not that they're the only ones, right? I think you're right. And a lot of times you'll see that even in scholarly articles, they cherry pick, as you said, Cassidy, certain type of information to juice up whatever they're trying to say or to convey a specific type of message in a certain way so the reader gets their point. Or it's I think it's kind of the reason I say it's ironic is because I feel like maybe they put that very specific piece of information into this document to spark something in parents or whoever the viewer was, in the same way that they were kind of making this argument that social media does that, is very manipulative and kind of makes you perceive certain things a certain way when there's so much more information out there, or there's certain things that you're not seeing behind doors. Kind of funny.
Yeah, where it almost can feel like they presented the information in a way where they were trying to create an emotional reaction through the music, through the subplot that was developed of like the storyline of that teen we were following the whole time. And there was so much emotions throughout it. Like the music, like I know music is a way to convey that, and it was so intense throughout the entire documentary, more so than I would have really expected for a documentary at that.
It definitely, the spliced like video that was happening in between, every time that popped on screen I was just like, here we go again. Yay.
Yeah, and it's tough because I think with this documentary I noticed myself having kind of like a torn view on it, because I think the information they presented was really important and I think it was really good, and I think anytime we're able to shed light on things that maybe the public isn't aware of, that's a good thing. Like I think we should have more information, and I think the challenge is that how often do people who are viewing this have the background we have in knowing about suicide rates? How often do they have this information? Because it made me think of, you both may have heard of this before, but that idea of there's a higher rate of like aggressive assaults or whatever it may be in the summer, and there's also a higher rate of ice cream being sold. And that doesn't necessarily mean that ice cream correlates to more aggression, because there's an outside lurking variable, which is the heat, and being overwarmed and like in the summertime leads to the aggression, and a lot of other factors. Like I'm not going to say it's the only one, but there's that piece of we have to be cautious with these presentations of information.